workshop. The Critical Theory Workshop is hosting today's event, which is also co-sponsored by Monthly Review and the International Manifesto Group. I am very happy to be moderating this discussion today of Domenico Losurdo's important book, Western Marxism: How It Was Born, How It Died, and How It Can Be Reborn. The English edition of this book, which was edited by Gabriel Rockhill, was just recently published by Monthly Review Press. In addition to the English translation of Losurdo's text, it also includes a previously unpublished text of Losurdo's on the topic of Western Marxism, as well as an introduction that Gabriel and I wrote. We have three very distinguished scholars here who will be speaking about Western Marxism: Rodica Desai, John Bellamy Foster, and Gabriel Rockhill. I'm going to introduce each of them more fully before they speak. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes or so, then they will have an opportunity to respond to each other, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and those questions can be written in the chat, and we're going to aim to wrap up in about 90 minutes total. Now, just before beginning with our first speaker, I want to just share a few introductory remarks. I'm going to keep those brief as I already spoke at an earlier launch for the book. In Western Marxism, Losurdo identifies an ideological tendency in theory promoted in the capitalist West. This is a tendency to, among other things, obfuscate and misconstrue imperialism, as well as to denigrate concrete efforts to struggle against it and to build socialism, particularly when these efforts do not live up to intellectuals' standard of theoretical or moral purity. This book is also then a critique of a type of intellectual practice that depicts itself as radical or even revolutionary, even though it is uninterested in collective efforts to build the power of the working class. Losurdo identifies this tendency among influential European and US American theorists who are promoted as radical thinkers by the Western theory industry, including many self-described Marxists. I think it's important to understand that Losurdo's analysis of this tendency in Western theory is one very focused part of a much larger critique he makes, which deals with the weakness of anti-imperialist politics in the capitalist West and the complicity of some parts of the self-denominated Western left in whitewashing US-led imperialism. Losurdo's book, The Communist Question and the Absent Left, both elaborate this broader critique very powerfully. They deal with, among other things, the US's imperialist aggressions in West Asia and North Africa, and the vast psychological warfare involved in marketing US militarism as advances for democracy and human rights. I think it's important to remember that Losurdo's more focused critique of Western theory, which we find in his book on Western Marxism, should be situated within a larger analysis of how support for imperialism is secured among the masses within the imperialist core. I also want to point out that Losurdo's analysis of this phenomenon is based on a historical materialist and dialectical analysis of knowledge production, not a culturalist dismissal of Western thought. Culturalist dismissals of Marxism, which can be readily found in postmodern, postcolonial, and decolonial theory, are based on totalizing characterizations of so-called Western thought or Western epistemology, and they generally aim to deny Marxism's relevance to social struggles taking place outside of the West. Their geographic or ethno-nationalist reductivism treats knowledge in an ahistorical, non-dialectical, and metaphysical manner, and tends to ignore the actual history of Marxist praxis as it has developed around the world. By comparison, Losurdo's account of Marxism is grounded in his deep appreciation of its global history and its proven importance to anti-colonial struggles in the global South. His criticisms of Western theory do not derive from any essentializing accounts of culture. Rather, he carefully elucidates the objective social forces that have, at particular historical conjunctures, produced ideological tendencies within the imperialist core that have led to deviations from the revolutionary and anti-colonial core of Marxism. Now, I'm very eager to turn this over to our first speaker, whose work I admire very much. That's Rodica Desai. Rodica is professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba, director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, convener of the International Manifesto Group, and past president of the Society for Socialist Studies. Her books include Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy, Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, and Intellectuals and Socialism, among others. She has also edited very important volumes about global political economy, geopolitics, contemporary imperialism, and multipolarity, and her writing also appears in venues such as The Guardian, The Hindu, Frontlines, RT, Global Times. And Dr. Desai is also host of the popular YouTube show Geopolitical Economy Hour. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you, Radhika.
Thanks a ton, Jennifer. That was a rather heavy-duty introduction. I'm just going to time myself. And it's really great to be here on this critical theory workshop panel, and also a seminar, webinar co-sponsored by Monthly Review, among others. Okay, so let me just dive right into it. So we live in a time when the left is in hitherto unimaginable disarray, with many of its leading elements lining up with a senile, neoliberal, financialized and monopolistic capitalist class of the homelands of capitalism, and their increasingly desperate and therefore existentially dangerous imperialist enterprises around the world. Given that Marxism has been the intellectually most vital core of left politics the world over, for the last century and a half, it is not surprising to learn, as we do from Losurdo's Western Marxism, that a goodly part of the malaise of Marxism emerges from the theoretical mistakes, malaise of the left emerges from the theoretical mistakes, deviations, confusions, hypocrisies, and above all, de-radicalizing obfuscations of one part of world Marxism, namely Western Marxism. If you agree with me that the chief symptom of the decay and disarray of Western Marxism is the fundamental confusion about imperialism, which has made it unable to mount a coherent opposition to the ongoing wars in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, and wars elsewhere, which has made them unable to name Western capitalist, imperialist, neoliberal, financialized capitalist classes as the culprits, and has them scurrying around to find evidence of alleged Russian and Chinese imperialism comparable to that of the West. Instead, and if you're looking for more intellectual ammunition to make your case, you couldn't read a better book than Losurdo's Western Marxism. Losurdo is quite aware of the occasion of his book. He says at a critical point in the argument, and I'm quoting now, we need to not lose sight of the anti-colonialist revolution, mostly led by communist parties, that was the main feature of the 20th century, and the unfortunate project of rolling back the anti-colonialist revolution, which is at the center of the so-called neoconservative revolution and of US foreign policy. Born in the horrors of the carnage of the First World War, Western Marxism has shown itself unable to understand and oppose the large-scale war that looms on the horizon. And he was writing this in 2017, or at least was published, the Italian version was published in 2017. He was clearly referring to very much our times. And he continues, the last sentence is, this is the death certificate of Western Marxism, and it is so apt. Well, of course, Losurdo hangs his critique of Western Marxism on the version delineated by Perry Anderson's 1976 work on the subject. He also traces the origin of key distinctions on which Anderson's delineation rested, the association of Western Marxism with political defeat, to Merleau-Ponty, who first noted how the Marxism of the East was much more concerned about anti-colonial revolutions rather than working class ones, and with the task of building an economy through statist means, rather than with the task of politically emancipating the working class from an oppressive state on the basis of an economy powerfully developed by capitalism itself. In Merleau-Ponty, this description was a neutral one. In valuing Western Marxism positively and Eastern Marxism in unremittingly negative terms, Anderson was following instead Max Horkheimer. It was he who indicted Soviet communism with having abandoned the abolition of the state to concentrate on the problem of the accelerated development of industrially backward fatherland. That was also a quote. Finally, Losurdo also contests Anderson's dating of the schism between Western and Eastern Marxism. It does not date, he says, as Anderson claims, in the stifling intellectual atmosphere allegedly generated by Stalinism. It was also present in 1917, though not, Losurdo clarifies, in 1914, when, quote, a tragedy that had been occurring for a long time in the colonies spread to Europe. Rather, Losurdo continues, it was October 1917, that is the revolution, that brought hope for the end of this tragedy to the colonies, and this is where he locates the origin of this bifurcation of Marxisms. But above all, Losurdo points out that in complacently valuing Western Marxism over a disparaged Eastern Marxism, Anderson was engaged in a most un-Marxist of intellectual moves, a theoretical advance unconnected with historical realities. This left many questions unanswered, and Losurdo listed them in a fine little rant, and here he goes. What philosophical theory and what political line had made possible this great new victory of the anti-colonial revolution, which followed that in China in 1949 and that in Cuba 10 years later? Why did this revolution continue to be guided by the communist movement? What relation was there between this revolution and the cause of a post-capitalist world? Was the struggle for national independence definitely over in China, Cuba, and Vietnam? Or did a new phase open under the banner of economic and technological development? On what then should relations of production be modeled? Without such questions, the failure to realize the initial expectations and hopes of the October Revolution, that is, if you don't ask these questions, then the initial expectations and hopes of the October Revolution end up as the unambiguous result of theoretical and political degeneration, which is then attributed to Eastern Marxism. Once this schism occurs, of course, a number of contrasts come to characterize Eastern and Western Marxism, where Western Marxism privileges the agency of the working classes alone, or rather one might qualify here the working classes of the West alone. Eastern Marxism saw in both the working classes the world over and the nations and states struggling for independence and development as the agents of socialism. Whereas Western Marxism tended to look forward to the abolition of the economy as such, and I'm quoting Losurdo quoting somebody else, Eastern Marxism was tasked by history with building and advancing economies. One might add here that the very notion that something called the economy might be abolished in itself, as I've argued extensively elsewhere, is the result of the fateful intellectual compromise, in Bukharin's word, a policy of theoretical reconciliation, that most Marxists of the turn of the 19th and 20th century made with the neoclassical economics that they should have fought tooth and nail. This gave them a Marxism that was without contradictions, and therefore, if it was without contradictions, then imperialism could not possibly arise from the contradictions of capitalism. And capitalism is believed to have no contradictions, and imperialism is believed not to be connected with capitalism in some currents of Western Marxism. And of course, there is this belief of in those currents of in capitalism's Promethean productivity, which is a particularly dangerous assumption today. But to continue with the contrast, however, where Western Marxists tend to believe in these Promethean productive capacities of capitalism, although this is not how Losurdo puts it, and are quite happy to equate science with domination, Eastern Marxism is eager to both advance and employ science in its own project of emancipation. Of course, this contrast tends to ignore Marx's very clear recognition that while capitalism does advance the forces of production, and therefore of science and technology, it does so brutally and chaotically, whereas socialism could be expected to do it in a benign and planned fashion. Whereas Western Marxism was perhaps tinged with Judeo-Christian messianism, Eastern Marxism is seen as more pragmatic, looking forward not so much to the abolition of work as to its development and refinement. Whereas Western Marxism remained preoccupied with individual dimensions of inequality and oppression, Eastern Marxism tended to look for and seek the evaluation not just of individuals, the emancipation not just of individuals, but of society. These contrasts between Western and Eastern Marxism, in addition to the anti-colonial and the addition of the anti-colonial struggle to the workers' struggle for emancipation, are documented richly by Losurdo, who weaves his story with strands of a profoundly intellectual and political history. He takes us through the key themes and thinkers of Western Marxism, opposing their limited and distorted views to those of the leaders and thinkers of key socialist revolutions to date. And the result is a fascinating story with very interesting twists and turns. He notes, for example, on page 78, how France had become a colony of the Third Reich. This makes us ponder the current situation of the countries of Europe, where it is once again dominated by foreign powers, this time the United States. And this reminds one of Lenin's imperialism, in which Lenin not only mentions this possibility, but also points out that with the division of the world among powers having been accomplished, one can only look forward to the struggles for its redivision and repartition among the various powers, a process that does not necessarily exclude the domination of other capitalist powers. A critically important point noted and worked in a variety of ways by Losurdo is that the anti-colonial movement is not merely about the wars that were often necessary to throw off the colonial yoke. These wars were only the beginning. They were followed by what is the essence of anti-imperialism in my view, and that is the task of building not only a socialist or communist society or something beginning to resemble that, but one that is strong enough, above all, to withstand the continuing pressure of imperialism. Much of the book is then taken up with this discussion that I mentioned earlier, which is enlightening and informative of how Western Marxist intellectuals have misunderstood and distorted the only revolutionary movements that have advanced under the banner of Marxism. In part 3, the discussion extends from the early post-war thinkers such as Althusser, Bloch, Bloch, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and others. Here one is impressed to see, for instance, that Horkheimer's argument about the ressentiment of the less developed, of the more developed, pioneered the argument that they hate us because we are prosperous. And that Marcuse anticipated modernization theory when he claimed that the dead weight of pre-technological and even pre-bourgeois customs and conditions offer strong resistance to development. Though one wonders whether the criticism of Althusser quite works, whether Althusser's critique of humanism might not have survived the anti-colonial test. Part 4 then focuses on the thinkers that come later, Arendt, Foucault, Hart and Negri and others, and part 5 on what Losurdo calls the final or degenerative phase of Western Marxism, including figures such as Zizek, Harvey Badiou, and others, leading to the death of Western Marxism, a phase in which Western Marxism seems to simply take leave of well-known facts and engages in evasions that are dressed up as intellectual strategies. Here I'd like to make a small criticism of the translation. The book is entitled Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, and How It Can Be Reborn. It clearly refers to Western Marxism. However, Losurdo does not speak, I think, unless I misunderstand him, of the rebirth of Western Marxism. He speaks instead of the rebirth of Marxism in the West and what would be required to shunt Marxism in that part of the world onto the right track. From the wrong one onto which it had been diverted, according to Losurdo, around the time of the Russian Revolution. And here I'll come to my concluding point. I want to make this point because I think it's very relevant, but at the same time, I don't want this to be seen as a criticism of Losurdo, simply a delineation of what he does do, which is what he sets out to do, from what he does not do, which he did not set out to do. And I cannot ask him to write a book other than the one he set out to write. This point emerges from my own work, which Jennifer mentioned, which is on geopolitical economy, the Marxist approach to international affairs that I have proposed, and which is very relevant here. It is also an approach on which the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group is based. The manifesto is entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, and clearly envisages different countries moving towards socialism at different rates and in different ways, and so on. So if we follow Losurdo so far, this kind of approach might be part of the renewal of Marxism in the West and worldwide. So the reason I bring it up is that in my own attempt to study Marx, study the classical Marxists, and then try to bring out what I believe is an original, but also a Marxist and a viable approach to world affairs, I found that there was a very important theoretical wrong turn that was taken by Marxists. And that was in the encounter with neoclassical economics, which I mentioned earlier. In this encounter, rather than fighting neoclassical economics, which had clearly emerged to displace classical political economy, whose culmination was the work of Marx, methodologically and theoretically, and to replace its central categories such as value and mode of production and relations of production and so on, with completely other a set of categories such as utility and supply and demand and prices and so on. So instead of attacking this frontally, and this was done initially by the likes of Bukharin and even Hilferding, but very soon this was given up in favor of what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation. And this gave rise to an understanding of Marxism which was without contradictions, which was therefore could not give rise to imperialism. And that is why this is the beginning of the theoretical mess that is the understanding of imperialism that we have today in the 20th century, beginning quite early on. So essentially, geopolitical economy develops Marx's view that class and nation are both agents of socialism. This is there in Marx. And if I had made a PowerPoint, I would have shown you a lovely poster that we did for a conference we organized, in which Marx says, around the time of the debates around free trade, that if the free trading the advocates of free trade do not understand how one country can become as rich at the expense of another, how should we expect to understand how one class can become rich at the expense of another? So clearly he puts class and nation right next to one another. And there's plenty of other evidence in Marx, including a very fine discussion of the economist Henry Carey, the American mercantilist economist Henry Carey in the Grundrisse, which further develops this understanding. And you can see that Marx is very aware of the effect of imperialism and what that means for the possibilities of development of other countries. So it's right there. And so geopolitical economy essentially develops these aspects of Marx. And I've written lots of different articles about this, and the one that perhaps most people might want to read is one I published in Capital and Class on the geopolitical economy of Marx. And in it, I take the idea of uneven and combined development, which is really nothing much more than the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, and put that at the center of the analysis of international relations. What drives international relations forward is the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism. Imperialism is necessary to capitalism, so you cannot possibly have a route to socialism that excludes anti-imperialist revolutions. So I could go on, but I won't for now, in the interest of time, and I'll maybe bring in some other points which are there in Losurdo, which we might perhaps reinterpret or certainly point out the limitations of. But on the whole, I would say that this work is absolutely central to understanding the world from the point of view of geopolitical economy, from the point of view of a Marxist understanding of world affairs, and therefore from the point of view of understanding why Western Marxism cannot get to grips with the current crisis in theoretically relevant terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Radhika. I'm going to, now we're going to hear from John Bellamy Foster. John is the editor of Monthly Review, the most important socialist magazine in the US, and he is a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. We recently had the honor of hosting a discussion about his most recent book, The Dialectics of Ecology, Socialism and Nature. His many other important publications on political economy and ecology include The Return of Nature, The Robbery of Nature, written with Brett Clark, Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature, The Great Financial Crisis, written with Fred Magdoff, The Ecological Rift, authored with Brett Clark and Richard York, and The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism, an elaboration of Marxian political economy. John, I'll turn it to you.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. The Critical Theory Workshop is a very important institution. I wanted to start off by indicating that there is a problem with the term Western Marxism, and we need to put that on the table. I mean, the term was introduced by Merleau-Ponty, and then Perry Anderson's very famous 1976 book on contribution to the analysis of Western considerations on Western Marxism was really quite crucial in defining it. But it's a very strange definition. The original notion of Western Marxism from Merleau-Ponty had a philosophical definition, which essentially came from footnote 6 of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, where Western Marxism, where Lukács had questioned Engels's notion of the dialectics of nature, and Western Marxism, in a post-Lukácsian sense, because Lukács didn't really adhere to this view, involved the complete rejection of the dialectics of nature, and with it materialism and so on. But of course, all of that is related to class and imperialism. When Perry Anderson wrote his book, and I read it right when it came out, it was handed to me, and I was shocked because he defined a certain kind of continental Marxism as Western Marxism, and systematically excluded not only Marxism in the rest of the world, but also much of Marxism in the West, including the Marxist historians in Britain, the entire range of Marxian political economy, all of the Marxists who'd worked in natural science, and so on. So it became simply a group that conformed to Anderson's view of basically within philosophy and culture that had certain characteristics. And we should critique this tradition, but we have to understand, and I think Losurdo really understood, although did not deal with this clearly enough in his book, that this is not to be confused with all Marxism in the West. It had Western Marxism as we speak of it, and we need to be precise, had certain characteristics and involved a certain set of thinkers. So we have to be careful not to conform too much to, say, Perry Anderson's definition of Marxism on the West, or we run into a big trap. I basically think there are ways of defining it, but we can say that Western Marxism is Eurocentric Marxism. And I tend to see it not exactly in the way that Losurdo does, or the way he presents it in this particular book, as Western Marxism versus Eastern Marxism, which is a kind of a troublesome split too. I see it as Western Marxism versus global Marxism, because it's not a question just of the East, it's a question of the global South, which is really rejected by Western Marxism, which is Eurocentric in character. Anyway, that's just a prefatory remark. I wanted to actually concentrate on just one sentence, one short sentence in Losurdo's book as kind of a key to how to approach this. He says on page 105 in his book, the idealistic regression was at the same time a Eurocentric regression. So what he's, and by idealist regression, the Losurdo mainly had in mind the retreat from class. But the idealist regression is at the same time a Eurocentric regression. We have to understand how these two terms that he uses to define Western Marxism, and here he's speaking particularly of Althusser, but I think it applies to Western Marxism as a whole. How is it that idealism, a tendency towards idealism, and a tendency to Eurocentrism are related to each other, or are dialectically connected to each other? Now, if we look at the idealist regression, as I said, Losurdo sees it mainly as a retreat from class and from a political economic critique. But we can go back to the philosophical definition of Western Marxism, which sees it first in terms of the rejection of the dialectics of nature, which is, of course, associated with Engels. And by rejecting the dialectics of nature, there's also a rejection of Engels and of Marxism itself, which is often said to have been invented by Engels, not by Marx, and of all of Soviet Marxism, or nearly all of it. And and to reject the dialectics of nature is basically to reject materialism. Because in a Marxist sense, you were talking about materialist dialectics and the dialectics of nature. If you reject a dialectical approach to nature, then or a materialist dialectics, all you have left in terms of materialism is mechanistic materialism, in sort of a positivist approach, or you have materialism simply being economics, which is an empty conception in itself. So you to reject the dialectics of nature in Marxist terms is to reject materialist dialectics and to reject Marx's materialism and Marx's dialectics and all that came out of that. And that's really crucial. So by doing that, by rejecting the dialectics of nature, which is critical to this whole tradition of Western Marxism, to the philosophical aspect, you end up rejecting the greater part of Marxism, certainly all of Soviet Marxism, but actually the most critical elements of Marx and Engels's thought, and any relation to nature, to science, to human beings as the self-mediating beings of nature. You're left with a dialectics as a mere identical subject-object, and a constant circle of reification where you can't. Where you deal with reification constantly, but you can never get down to the material relations because you've actually vacated that from your analysis. All meaningful analysis of production involves not only the materialist conception of history, but materialist conception of nature. We have to understand it in those terms. So all of that gets eliminated, and in this idealist regression, and of course, then it reinforces a retreat from class itself. Now, in terms of the Eurocentric regression, Losurdo definitely has imperialism in mind, but the use of Eurocentric here is very important. He doesn't define Eurocentrism, and it's normally not defined, which creates a problem, because naturally there is a certain kind of ethnocentrism in any culture, in any cultural tradition. So Europeans are going to have a European ethnocentrism pretty much from birth, just like any other culture, and we hopefully become more universalist as we broaden our perspective. But ethnocentrism is not the same thing as Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is a form of culturalism, as is the primary form of culturalism, really, as Radhika was talking about. The best way to understand it is in terms of Max Weber's Introduction to the Sociology of Religion, which is usually published in the front of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Weber says that Europe is the only universal culture. There are other cultures in the world, but they are particular cultures. Only Europe is a universal culture. And so all other cultures, while they may retain some of their particular aspects, have to eventually follow the European culture, which also defines modernity and so on. That's the characteristic of Eurocentrism, and it's the cultural ideology of Western imperialism. So to say that there's a Eurocentric regression is to talk about how imperialism is disregarded in Western Marxism. Losurdo doesn't really come up with a lot of examples of, very few examples of the Western Marxists actually directly rejecting imperialism. Rather, they simply adopt Eurocentric arguments approach where Marxism itself is European first and forever, and no other part of the world can have an authentic Marxism. Only the West can. So Marxism itself is treated in Eurocentric terms, but they basically ignore the rest of the world. And since revolutionary class struggle has diminished to the point of invisibility in the West, they basically write off class struggle and revolution along with imperialism and move in an orbit of perpetual cultural criticism, which is valuable and can be sophisticated, but cut off from all material bases and from the real revolutions going on in the rest of the world, ends up being empty and vacuous and actually indirectly supporting the system. So this becomes a problem. Luke, in his work on Lenin, Lukács had wrote, Lenin's superiority, and this is an unparalleled theoretical achievement, consists of his concrete articulation of imperialism with every practical problem of the present epoch. Now, the tradition that I belong to mostly as editor of Monthly Review, the whole tradition of Monthly Review has been involved in the critique of imperialism since its formation in 1949, and this is our view that the monopoly stage of capitalism, imperialism, this is the critical element that we have to understand, and this really defines Marxism in the late 20th and 21st century. So, but you can't find that view in what we're talking about in terms of Western Marxism, the main continental Marxist philosophers, the vast majority of them. And we see that in terms of Lukács, in his Destruction of Reason, in the part of his book that has actually attacked the most was attacked by Adorno, writing for a U.S. Army established and CIA-funded publication, attacked by George Lichtheim and Frederick Jameson and Enzo Traverso in his, ironically, in his new introduction to the Destruction of Reason. What's attacked is the epilogue, and the epilogue to the Destruction of Reason is titled Post-War Irrationalism, and it connects the irrationalism of fascism in the Second World War period and before to the rise of U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism, and shows the relationship between those. He was writing during the Korean War, and Western Marxists to this day consider that to be Lukács's greatest sin, is writing that epilogue that directly criticized the post-war left and the thinkers that we're talking about for not opposing imperialism, actually getting absorbed in it. Now, I think that if we put these two parts together, the idealist regression and the Eurocentric regression, understanding that the idealist regression involves the abandonment of Marx's fundamental materialist ontology and everything that came out of that, and the Eurocentric regression, and in which means centering on Europe and neglecting, either benignly neglecting or overtly neglecting imperialism. We have the basic characteristics of Western Marxism as I think Losurdo understood. I have some problem with his criticism of Ernst Bloch and Herbert Marcuse. I think that Losurdo overreaches himself in a couple of places. He criticizes Bloch for not writing about imperialism, and but every scholar draws certain lines around their work. The question is, did Bloch approach things in such a way that he basically fits within this Western Marxist definition? I think that Bloch breaks out of it. For one thing, Bloch, along with Bertolt Brecht, they chose to live in East Germany, where Adorno and Horkheimer were invited back by the U.S. occupying forces to live in West Germany, and were funded by the U.S. authority initially, and that creates a very different dynamic. Bloch was very much a defender of dialectical materialism or materialist dialectics, which puts him on the other side primarily in this division, even though he didn't write about imperialism. So I would, Alfred Schmidt, who wrote his dissertation on the concept of nature in Marx under the supervision of Horkheimer and Adorno, mainly attacks Bloch and Brecht for following Marx in arguing for the reconciliation of nature and humanity, arguing instead that that's impossible. And I think that it's very important to understand that there was a big division there, with Bloch defending a materialist dialectics and bringing to it a whole longer tradition in various ways. The other thing is Marcuse, that I understand and I agree with some of the criticisms of Marcuse, but I think Losurdo overplays his hand a little bit there, because Marcuse actually did critique imperialism significantly, and Losurdo points that out. So that puts Marcuse in a very different place. He also didn't go back to West Germany. He stayed in the United States and wrote a really powerful defense of Paul Baran's critique of imperialism, and wrote about imperialism extensively. So I don't see him on that criterion as being in the same place as the others, although I do think that there are a lot of places where Marcuse falls into traps, particularly the idealist regression. if not as much the Eurocentric digression. So these are just the various thoughts. But I think that the big problem with Western Marxism, as we're talking about it, is that it was, it was quite sophisticated, but it systematically excluded Marx's materialist perspective and the whole imperialist perspective, which starts with Marx and goes through Lenin and so on, and all the imperialist struggles. All of this is excluded. So the Marx's own analysis of materialism gets discarded and is undeveloped in the literature. It's almost argued that Marx isn't a materialist, but the extraordinary work that Marx did in that respect is almost unknown today. And also, as Rodica says, Marx's own understanding of imperialism is only really being rediscovered today. So this is a fault that I place with Western Marxism. They have steered us in the wrong direction. And so we nowadays know more about Hegel, and I think Hegel is superior to a lot of the Western Marxist work, that he doesn't have some of these problems, but we know more about Hegel in some ways than we know about Marx within the Western Marxist tradition, and that's really a tragedy along with all the rest. So I believe, as Radhika says, in the rebirth of Western Marxism, but not as Western Marxism, as a component of global Marxism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Now we're going to hear from Gabriel Rockhill. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, professor of philosophy, and associate director of the Cultural Studies program at Villanova University, and research associate at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. Gabriel has published 10 books, including most recently Requiem for French Theory, written with Aymeric Monville. He is currently completing Who Paid the Piper of Western Marxism, the first volume in The Intellectual World War, a trilogy of books that is under contract with Monthly Review Press. Gabriel is co-editor of the World Marxist Review and of the Anti-Imperialist Marxism book series, and his more public-facing writings can be found in venues like Monthly Review, LA Review of Books, New York Times, and Counterpunch. Gabriel?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, John and Radhika. I should say to start with that it's a real honor to participate in this panel with both of you, because I think that you are some of the most important Marxists working in the Western world, and it's wonderful to have your historical perspective and your kind of learned overview concerning these complex histories. It's also an honor to have the Critical Theory Workshop collaborate with the International Manifesto Group and Monthly Review. In my comments today, I thought that in the interest of time, because I co-authored the introduction with Jennifer, I've also had a number of opportunities to publicly talk about the book through a series of launches, that what I should do is instead focus on what I see as elements within Losurdo's work that I've been developing in dialogue with a number of other scholars, particularly in the works that Jennifer mentioned, the book with Aymeric Monville and the forthcoming projects from Monthly Review. Because one of the undertakings in this book draws precisely on the importance of understanding Western Marxism as, in part, a product of the imperial superstructure. What I mean by the imperial superstructure is the institutionalized ideological framework that has been developed in the world's leading imperialist power, the United States, and has at least partially been globalized through cultural imperialism. The superstructure, as Marx explained, is composed of two components. There's a political-legal apparatus that's centered in the bourgeois state, as well as a cultural apparatus, meaning this is not his vocabulary, but I think it sums up what it was that he was talking about. There's an entire system of production, circulation, and consumption of culture in the broadest sense of this term, right? So it includes religion, culture, philosophy, the arts, etc. And this cultural apparatus is made up of all of the social institutions that regulate the production and dissemination of culture. including the educational system, religious institutions, culture industries, and much more. Now, the reason I think it is important to approach the issue of Western Marxism from the vantage point of an analysis of the imperial superstructure is that it allows us to develop a systemic account of the fundamental forces driving it, rather than slipping into an idiosyncratic analysis that assumes, for instance, that Western Marxism is simply the result of the aggregated contributions of individual thinkers who were autonomously coming up with projects, and those projects succeeded in the so-called marketplace of ideas. Instead, this more systemic approach sheds light on the concrete linkages between the economic base and the ideological superstructure, while avoiding all forms of reification and reductionism, meaning that it's important as well to pay ample attention to the subjective agency of individual intellectuals, but also always situating them within the broader world in which their agency is exercised, meaning within the objective social totality. It's precisely by foregrounding this dialectical play of forces between the objective elements of their material context and the imperial superstructure more specifically, and the subjective agency of intellectuals on the other hand, that you can really bring into relief the phenomenon known as Western Marxism. And I think both Rodica and John highlighted some good examples of the ways in which there were, acts or writings on the part of particular individuals that didn't really fit within the overall structure of Western Marxism, precisely by getting clear on both these individual subjective agencies and then the overall system of cultural production that I think we can shed the best possible light on this phenomenon of Western Marxism. Now, one important aspect of this, and this overlaps particularly with John's comments, is that much of what is referred to as Western Marxism is a product very specifically of the theory industry, and the imperial theory industry more specifically, right? We're talking about those who are within a kind of philosophic and theoretical realm, much more so than a lot of the social scientists who have worked in the kind of modern Western world. Now, Marxism, I think, historically has tended to have wide public appeal due to its clear explanatory and transformative power, and it has not been possible to simply eradicate it, including within the imperial core. And this has created a problem for the owners of the means of intellectual production and those who manage their interests. And that is, well, how can you deal with the fact that you can't simply eradicate Marxism? And I think the principal solution to that has been to try to foster, through various means, many of them economic, the development of a version of Marxism that is ultimately compatible with capitalist interests. It's a version of Marxism that tends to condemn actually existing socialism, often in the strongest possible terms. And as critical as it may sometimes be of capitalism, it traffics in capitalist accommodationism and sometimes openly supports imperialism. Since it is known that the capitalist ruling class and its managers have a history of supporting what they call the compatible left, meaning compatible with capitalism, we might call this version of Marxism compatible Marxism, or Marxism compatible with the agenda of the capitalist ruling class in the West, or in the imperial core. Consider a few statements. Quote, "The failure of all socialist and communist experiences in the last century had as its consequences that we do not have today a great and clear idea of another world." End quote. Communism, this is another quote, and more specifically Stalinism, is maybe the worst ideological, political, ethical, social catastrophe in the history of humanity. Yet another quote, "Socialism and capitalism never were opposites, but rather, as many critical analysts of the Soviet Union claimed, socialism is a regime for the state management of capitalist production." End quote. These are all authors who figure very prominently in the Verso book publication entitled The Idea of Communism. There, Alain Badiou was the first quote, Slavoj Žižek was the second, and the third was Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. These are the leading luminaries of Western Marxism today. We see here clearly that the idea of communism for these Western Marxists stands in the starkest possible contrast to the practice. So Western Marxism, I think, needs to be understood as a broader ideological project of radical recuperation. It waves the red flag of Marxism, and it often claims to be the most authentic, rigorous, and advanced form thereof, thereby revealing its social chauvinism, or what John was referring to as Eurocentrism. However, its fundamental function within the broader social world and class struggle is to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within, at a minimum, an anti-communist worldview, though often one that also directly segues with capitalist and imperialist interests. The Western Marxists thereby play the ideological role of radical recuperators. We should, of course, be attentive to the dialectical nature of this attempted unity of opposites between radical politics on the one hand and capitalist recuperation on the other. It is indeed the case that many Western Marxists have spread some knowledge that can be useful regarding how capitalism functions and important critiques thereof. It is possible to learn things from them. However, their ultimate ideological orientation and contribution need to be situated within the social totality and more specifically the imperial superstructure. The bourgeois cultural apparatus and elements of the bourgeois state have promoted their work as the most cutting-edge form of Marxist theory precisely because it is explicitly opposed to the practical undertaking of breaking the chains of imperialism and building socialism in the real world. The dialectical relationship between the forces of the imperial superstructure and the agency of the most prominent Western Marxists therefore needs to be elucidated. Rather than simply being an accidental convergence, there is a very coherent and systemic relationship that becomes visible as soon as we engage in dialectical materialist analysis. These are subjects, intellectuals, who give to the system of imperial knowledge production what it demands in order to receive uplift in return. So Western Marxism could be described more precisely as imperial Marxism, in the sense that it is the type of Marxism fostered by the imperial core and within its theory industry, while being one that tends to accommodate this Marxism and even in certain instances celebrate imperialism. This version of Marxism is, moreover, a commodified form of Marxism. It has enormous exchange value within the imperial professional managerial class stratum, but little to no use value for the struggle against imperialism and socialism. To shed a little more light on this political economy driving Western Marxism as a product of the imperial theory industry, it's important to note that it has been widely supported and promoted within the major industries of capitalist cultural production, including universities, publishing houses, the art and cultural world, etc. Moreover, the capitalist ruling class and the bourgeois state have also been directly involved in promoting it in various ways. So in the interest of space and in my concluding comments, I'd just like to highlight two examples. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory is widely considered to be one of the principal contributors to Western Marxism. It's important to know that during their wartime and immediate post-war exile in the United States, the majority of the associates of the Frankfurt School, 7 of them, were not employed as professors or full-time researchers with the Institute for Social Research. Instead, they were in the employ of the US government, working for a combined total of 50+ years in various state agencies, including the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, and propaganda agencies like the Office of War Information and Voice of America. They were thus intellectuals and purported Marxists who labored in the service of the capitalist state that would emerge from the war as the leading imperialist power. They formed a veritable Washington school at the time, and their governmental work, their service to empire, was in many ways their career springboard because it launched them into prestigious positions in the academy, including at Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, Stanford, and other major institutions. In other words, serving as the Washington School helped make the Frankfurt School into what is arguably the most internationally renowned school of Western Marxism. I hope we all see the contradiction here. The leading school of Western Marxism cut its teeth not by fighting imperialism, but by serving the world's emerging leading imperialist state. Now, this is not to deny, and I must insist on this point, that there are not some intricacies, contradictions, and nuances to these histories that I'm setting aside in the interest of space, and I'd be happy to discuss these in the Q&A. I just want to highlight the one element of that specific relationship. Moreover, the capitalist ruling class of this same imperialist state, the United States, has been directly involved in funding and promoting the Frankfurt School. The Rockefeller robber barons were the leaders, providing numerous collective and individual grants. John, of course, alluded to this. But one of their projects was entitled the Marxism-Leninism Project. Rockefeller invested the equivalent today of approximately $1.7 million in this project up to 1960. It financed a global network of institutions, established international research groups, funded 9 global conferences, supported scholarly exchanges and meetings, set up a research program in New York, supported dissertations, funded numerous publication projects, one of whose goals was to make purportedly authentic versions of Marxist texts available that had not been perverted by Moscow's influence. It also set up a collaborative network between participating institutions across Europe, whose backbone was formed out of the Eastern European Institutes of the Free University in Berlin, the Amsterdam International Institute for Social History, and the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. In short, the Rockefeller Foundation established an expansive, well-funded, international material system of knowledge production, distribution, and consumption, whose explicit objective was to wage doctrinal warfare on Marxism-Leninism in favor of promoting and supporting Western Marxism. Since I was just in the Rockefeller Center archive unearthing additional details concerning this project, I should note that this was only one small endeavor situated within an extremely vast undertaking of intellectual imperialism and neocolonialism that consisted in funding the development of powerful knowledge networks across Western Europe that would serve US interests. In France, for instance, the principal institutional stronghold for both structuralism and the Annales School was funded by the same capitalist interests and was part of the same overall project. Both of these traditions, structuralism, French structuralism, and the Annales School, were recognized by the US state as making major contributions to anti-communist research. At the center of the Rockefeller's Marxism-Leninism project was Herbert Marcuse. At the request of his close personal friend, who was one of his greatest academic supporters, a man by the name of Philip Moseley, Marcuse was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to spend a long sojourn in Paris at the structuralist stronghold that I just mentioned, and he was entrusted with the mission of drawing, this is a quote, drawing the Marxists among France's intellectuals into the Western camp, meaning making them Western Marxists, without them having to give up their Marxism, end quote. In other words, Marcuse was on an ideological mission, which he knew full well about because he corresponded about this, and it was part of the reason he received this particular grant, although he received a lot of other funding from the Rockefellers as well. And this was in order to convert Marxists in the West to Western Marxism. I mentioned that this was at the behest of his friend and supporter, Philip Moseley, in part because Moseley was a long-time, top-level CIA consultant with a clearance of the security level top secret. The US state was working hand in glove with the capitalist ruling class, as well as the institutions of the cultural apparatus, in waging an intellectual world war on anti-imperialist Marxism. Although Marcuse disingenuously misrepresented his government work in later interviews, the archival record is clear. Marcuse worked closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he even had a hand in writing national intelligence estimates, which are the highest form of national intelligence. This was his springboard into the academic world, and his first positions were at CIA cutouts in the academy, the Russian Institute at Columbia and the Russian Research Center at Harvard. Marcuse was, at least in his early career and during his rise to fame, a Western Marxist who worked in the service of empire. None of this, I should note, negates what John had highlighted about Marcuse's radicalization and the important contradictions in the history of his life and work, because he did come out as a strong supporter for certain forms of anti-imperialist struggle, as well as the Black liberation struggle, the women's struggle, the ecological struggle, and other such things. So as dialectical analysts, we have to be able to engage in, a fine-grained assessment. Nevertheless, and these are my concluding remarks, we see here then that Western Marxism is not just an organic outgrowth of the imperial superstructure. It has been directly fashioned and promoted by the world's leading imperialist state and its capitalist ruling class. This should give us a very clear sense of its purpose, which is to denigrate, destroy, and sideline anti-imperialist Marxism, global Marxism, international Marxism, we could use other terms for this, while replacing that form of Marxism, or just universal Marxism, replacing it with a propagandistic, commercialized version of Marxism, intent on convincing readers that imperialism is not the fundamental problem, and the real world socialism is not the solution. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Gabriel. So now we are going to have an opportunity for the speakers to add some additional comments. And meanwhile, those in the audience, if you have questions, it's a good time to start thinking about them, putting those in the chat, because we'll open up for questions after the speakers can each respond. We'll start with you, Radhika. Oh, you're unmuted.
Okay, so I'm just absolutely fascinated by John and Gabriel's discussions, and gosh, there's so many things to say, but in general, I found them very interesting and absorbing. And one, I'll go with Gabriel first, and then John, since Gabriel spoke most recently. I mean, one of the things I've often puzzled about, and I'd love to know the views of others on this, is, why is it that people who are actually quite conservative in reality want to pose as Marxists? Like, what's in it? What's the deal? Why do they want to pose as Marxists? Obviously, one is that by posing as Marxists, they muddy the waters, they etc. But nevertheless, I'd love to hear if there's anything I'm missing here. Obviously, again, the combination of the complete misunderstanding and, generally speaking, the failure to even mention the reality of imperialism, or the deliberate obfuscation of the reality of imperialism or evasion of it, is again part of this general understanding that I feel is part of Western Marxism, although I take the strictures that I think, John, you laid out very well, that, Western Marxism is probably a more problematic category than certainly I was making it out to be. But having accepted those, let me just say that there is this conception of Western Marxism, that at least that is there in Losurdo, that I broadly agree with. It combines the condemnation of actually existing socialism with a complete failure to comprehend the reality of not the reality so much as the necessity of imperialism to capitalism. And so what that then does is it recuperates capitalism, and the principal fashion in which capitalism is recuperated today is something that, Gabriel, you were touching on, and that is what I call neo-Proudhonism. That is to say, the idea that capitalism is only about markets and competition and small enterprises and so on, and completely neglecting the fact that, as Marx anticipated already before he died, that capitalism was moving to a monopoly phase, that once it was at its monopoly phase, it was basically past its sell-by date, that it had to, it will be ripe for conversion into socialism, etc. And by the way, Lenin in particular, in his Imperialism, refers to this idea repeatedly. He goes back to it so often. It's incredible. But anyway, so this neo-Proudhonism emerges to kind of make it out as if capitalism can be retained. But of course, if you accept their arguments and follow up their policy consequences, what is maintained is, of course, this current, what I call senile monopoly capitalism. Further, I mean, I was intrigued, Gabriel, by your tendency to distinguish between the theory industry and the social sciences. So if you could say something more, we can have a discussion about it, because I personally feel I have a bigger critique of the modern social sciences, which I think would be interesting to go into if you like. I loved your idea of the imperial superstructure. Really good idea, and the general systematic way of understanding the production, circulation, and distribution of culture. Great. For John, I just want to make two comments and then leave it at that. So the first is that I think the ideological and Eurocentric regression or deviations, or whatever you want to call them, distortions, are linked. So if you, on the one hand, have the abandonment of the material dimension, that material dimension includes imperialism, as I would like to urge you all to understand, is that it includes imperialism because, of course, it is rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. It is not optional for capitalism. It is necessary for capitalism. It must happen if capitalism is to survive. And part of the reason capitalism is in crisis today is because we are living in a time when an increasing number of countries are able to deny to the homelands of capitalism, to the metropoles, as we might say, imperial privileges, which they have hitherto had. Part of this potential of denial of this has always been there, and we have been through a similar crisis before. And to me, the resurgence of inflation in particular is a very important sign of this, or a symptom of this, because the suppression of inflation has historically relied on the metropoles being able to access the products of third world labor for next to nothing. And when that ability goes, then you get inflation. You got that in the 70s, and then that crisis was temporarily resolved, but it has resurged once again. So so to me, that idealist and Eurocentric regressions are linked. And then the second is that, of course, I'm very, to some extent, I'm fairly familiar, let me put it that way, with this whole critique, the Brenner critique of the monthly review school and the whole back and forth and so on. So to me, the Western Marxist emphasis, or the what we call political Marxist emphasis on the relations of production, and the Smithian Marxist view, which, whatever else you may fault it for, has had the honorable tradition of always emphasizing imperialism. These two traditions can be reconciled in what I'm calling geopolitical economy, precisely because it overcomes a critical theoretical lacuna, which is actually, in my humble opinion, shared by both. That is to say, the inability to root imperialism in the contradictions of capitalism because of this history of the policy of theoretical reconciliation with neoclassical economics. And if we could reconcile that, we could actually create a theoretical understanding that unites the working class struggle around the world with the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle around the world into and they're not the same, but they are very deeply connected, they're very deeply related, and they are both necessary to lead to socialism. So I think we could do something like that. So I will just say those things right now and leave it at that. Oh, and I have, sorry, one further question. I would love John to reflect, after having read Losurdo's book, why he doesn't mention, I mean, I agreed with so many of your comments, so why doesn't Losurdo mention the monthly review tradition at all? So, because I don't think he mentions it, but yeah, there it is, yeah.
Thank you, Radhika. I'll turn it over to you, John.
Well, Losurdo doesn't mention the monthly review tradition because he basically falls into the trap of following Anderson's book and letting Anderson's demarcation basically define his own efforts, counter efforts. But Anderson excluded political economy very effectively. If you look at the footnotes, he excluded, let's say, Paul Sweezy, excluded E.P. Thompson, he excluded all of the thinkers of, all the political economic thinkers, all the natural scientists, all the materialists. He found ways to exclude them from his analysis. And Losurdo just basically deals with the thinkers that Anderson deals with. So he it's partly the way his project was defined in this book. So he doesn't confront the fact that the most prominent theories of imperialism, the ones that, in the post-Second World War period, were all developed, Marxist theories of imperialism were all developed by Western thinkers. And so that's a complicated thing. Western thinkers who were allied with the global South. And so that's a weakness of the analysis, but one can't do everything. I was a little perplexed by your comments, Radhika, because when you said that the idealistic regression and the Eurocentric regression were connected, I thought that was what I was saying. I think you were thinking you were differing with me, and I must not have been clear. I was saying the important thing is that Losurdo connected these. How do we understand the relationship? Why does the idealistic regression promote the Eurocentric regression and vice versa? Why are they linked? And that was really the nature of what I was trying to convey, which clearly I didn't convey well enough. In terms of the Brenner critique of Smithian Marxism, haven't heard that for a long time, but I thought that, I mean, Brenner was totally off the wall, and and I can't go into all of this, but the thing is that you say, well, the monthly review tradition was unable to root imperialism and capitalist political economy. Well, we're talking about all the major theorists of imperialism in the Second World War period, which were all attached to monthly review. You're talking about Paul Baran and Sweezy, Andre Gunder Frank. They all had weaknesses. Frank's approach was quite weak. And you're talking about Samir Amin. You're talking about world systems theory, unequal exchange theory. I think that all of these traditions actually grew out of the classical theory of imperialism. And for monthly review, Lenin's theory of imperialism is still the foundation for the entire analysis. And our understanding is imperialism developed out of monopoly capitalism, or monopoly capitalism is imperialism. So I don't really see how your criticism applies, and unless you're adopting Brenner's interpretation as correct, which I thought was, it's nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham once said. It has nothing to do. It was that whole argument that, these guys deal with exchange, so they can't have anything to do with production, which is absolutely absurd. And if you approach questions of imperialism that way, it just becomes an apologetics, which was what Brenner was part of, the rejection of imperialism theory. And that's exactly why he was attacking monthly review, but because a monthly review it's basically has been the center of imperialism theory in North America, at least, and linked to the global South throughout our history. And so I don't think we have any disagreements. I just think that maybe you think that we're in disagreement when we're not. And I personally agree with everything you said. So, and I have nothing to challenge you on. It was very good. And Gabriel, there were just a couple of small points I wanted to raise, because I agree with your whole argument. And when I referred to the Adorno and Horkheimer being divided back into West Germany as by the U.S. authorities and actually paid by them. This is part of that whole process, and you and I have talked about it. But this is something that has not been talked about, the objective circumstances of all of this. One place where I have questions is in the Office of Strategic Services. It's true that it turned into the CIA eventually. It was later converted into the CIA, but the Office of Strategic Services, which arose in the Second World War, there were all sorts of people involved in that on the left, who is part of the anti-Nazi war. And the Office of Strategic Services was really crucial in that. So people like Paul Sweezy, more indirectly Paul Baran, Franz Newman, a lot of really important figures, that had, of course, connections to the Frankfurt School, like Baran and so on. But a lot of them were involved in the Office of Strategic Services, and in Baran's case, the Strategic Bombing Survey. This was part of the war effort in the case of Nazi Germany. And Sweezy, our author, was the editor of the European Political Report, which provided a historical materialist analysis. Although it was funded by the government, it provided a historical materialist analysis that's notable of everything that was happening during the war. And so a lot of them were involved in sincerely fighting Nazism. But the difference with Marcuse is that he didn't leave the government security establishment right away. Instead entered the Office of Intelligence Services, or an Office of Intelligence Research. And his Soviet Marxism was based on a critique of the Soviet Union, a very one-sided critique of the Soviet Union that he did for U.S. intelligence, and then he made it into a book. So I said that Losurdo went overboard in his criticism of Marcuse, and I think that in a way that's true, because he cites all these things that Marcuse said against imperialism, and then just sort of says he didn't do enough. But his argument there in his book is not convincing. Your argument is convincing. I mean, I think that the things that you are doing are necessary in order to really bring Losurdo's work to fruition. He wasn't able to do the kind of objective analysis in terms of the objective conditions that you're now doing. And I was introduced to some of this by Mazuros, who was very critical of Adorno and Horkheimer. And in Month Review, there also was, Paul Baran was very, very critical of Adorno and Horkheimer and what they were doing. So we had this kind of internal critique that's very important. And some of these objective relations were known, but in the background, but they've been held in the background. And now, thanks to your work, they're coming out. And I think this is incredibly important if we're going to straighten out this mess and move away from a Eurocentric to Western Marxism toward what I would say is a global Marxism. Marxism is global. It isn't Western or Eastern. It stands with all of humanity, or all of oppressed humanity, and we can't divide it into hemispheres or simply geopolitical blocks. The main problem is the capitalist core, which is still located in the West, and it's still the same dominant 6 or 7 imperial powers. The same ones as in Lenin's day are the ones that we really have to confront today.
Thank you, John. Gabriel?
I thought those were some wonderful comments. I'll just pick up on a few of the threads. One thing that I really appreciated that both Rodica and John brought to the fore is the question of dialectics and contradictions. And Rodica, in particular, you insisted on there being a kind of Marxism without contradictions. And what could that possibly mean? Because ultimately, you're getting rid of the contradictions of imperialism and, in certain cases, even just class struggle, right? And so I think centering that and really teasing out the meanings of that, because for some people, they might react and say, well, no, there is a lot of dialectics in Western Marxism, but that type of dialectics is like what Lenin called a toy rattle, right? It's a rhetorical stratagem where you say it's like this, it might be like that, it might be the opposite. We can go back and forth, but it spins in the void. John, I love the sentence that you used where you said that dialectics is a constant circle of reification that can't get down to material relations. And so I thought that was also an interesting point of continuity between Rodica's criticisms and John's criticisms, and really that the form of global Marxism or anti-imperialist Marxism that we're talking about is one that is dialectical, but it's a materialist form of dialectics that is paying attention to the kind of specificities of particular conjunctures and particular struggles. And one thing that I did want to highlight, because I think it might be helpful for engaging with Losurdo, is that in this book and in a lot of his other work, I see him as in kind of embodying a dialectical method. He's not giving us an empirical encyclopedia of the totality of Western Marxism. He's not giving us a complete account of each of the figures that he's engaging with. What he's doing is he's taking particular elements of their writings, particular moments of global class struggle, and he's theoretically articulating them at a higher level so that then we can see the relationship between these particular manifestations and a general or universal pattern and structure, if you will, which doesn't mean that then every single instance correlates to that pattern. But what it does mean, it's almost like a constellational approach, that the particular, it's very Hegelian, is the manifestation of the universal, or that the general structure only manifests itself in these particular instances. And I think it's a very interesting form of dialectical materialist methodology that he's marshaling. And so I just wanted to float that out as a kind of topic of conversation because it seems like it overlaps with what everyone was talking about. Maybe just going relatively quickly through some of the other issues. Radhika, on the theory industry, I reference that because I do think that in a certain sense, the danger of Western Marxism principally is when it becomes extra-disciplinary and it grips the masses because it saturates into the activist and organizing world. And that, someone's work like, I don't know, Hart and Negri or Badiou, this is work that a lot of people in a lot of disciplines feel like they have to be familiar with. And it does saturate a lot of activist circles in the way that some, Marxist social scientific research does not. But I think you raise a fundamental point. It would be great to have follow-up conversations about that, is the effects on the social sciences and very specifically the bourgeois social sciences, how they've operated historically and institutionally. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on those specific criticisms. The question concerning why do certain intellectuals pose as Marxists, I do see this in terms of the class standing of a lot of the intellectuals in the imperial core who are in the academy. And that is that if you're in the professional managerial class stratum, your manifesto actually for the IMG talks about this very specifically, you're working for the bourgeoisie or the owners of the means of production, but you're situated between them and the general working class. And many of that middle layer will be like the Fukuyamas and the Huntingtons and the Snyders and other people today, who they're just pitching to the capitalist ruling class and they're shoring up the dominant ideology. But there's also another orientation, and that is those in this middle layer who want to appear like they're on the side of the people, but have no material interest and no real dedication to transforming the structures of power that keep the people below them. And so there's a kind of posturing that often occurs in the left wing of the professional managerial class stratum, where you want to appear radical, but you really don't want anything to change. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe just touching on and actually, I'll just give a shout out. Rodica has an excellent piece on the kind of neo-Proudhonianism of Badiou and some of these other figures, because there's a strong anarchist tendency in a lot of this work that we haven't really touched on, but I thought I'd at least mention in passing. Yes, John, the OSS, you're absolutely right. I have a lot of detailed work on this. It is important that the OSS, the action arm of the OSS, while Marcuse was working in it, was working on projects to sign peace agreements with the Nazis in order to allow there to be peace in the West so that the Nazi genocidal rampage could continue unabated in the East. And that was being done by Alan Dulles, who then would become the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then with Operation Sunrise and other activities, they were incorporating the fascists and the Nazis into the Western imperial framework during and immediately after the war. It doesn't mean that Marcuse was doing that or some of these other intellectuals, because there was a compartmentalization in which you had the action arm and the research arm. But it's a kind of much more complex history, and I'll just mention this in passing, but Franz Neumann, from at least what we know from the current archival record, this could change in the future, there are suggestions that he was giving intelligence to the Soviets, including the negotiations on the part of Dulles to sign a peace agreement with the high command of the Nazis just below Hitler. And so it's a much more intricate history. And I'll just leave it at that, because I agree fully with your comments about needing nuance on that front. The last thing that I'll say, and this will be to just open it back up, is I wanted to cycle back to, John made this point as well, but Radhika, you really insisted on the real question is, well, how do we rejuvenate Marxism, given that we've inherited the kind of scourge of Western Marxism? And I'll just suggest one thing, but I'd be curious thoughts more broadly, is that we have to do this work collectively. It's no individual who's going to solve this problem. And that one of the principal ways that Western Marxism has been so powerful is because it has institutional power. It has the owners and the managers of the means of communication and intellectual production driving it in various ways. And so we need institutional power, and we need to develop and further consolidate, platforms like Monthly Review, International Manifesto Group, Critical Theory Workshop, and others that allow us to create a real community of progressive scholarship, research, and activism in order to kind of socialize this broader struggle for a form of Marxism that is dedicated to the concrete task of dismantling imperialism and moving in a socialist direction. But Jennifer, with those thoughts, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you all so much. We do have some questions in the chat. So maybe I'll start by sharing two of them, and then you guys can respond how you want, and then we can do another round. We have one of the questions asks, to what extent are Trotskyism and left communism part of the Western Marxist tradition that's being diagnosed? And another question asks, do you think that anti-imperialists in the imperial core should use different strategies than anti-imperialists in the global South? And I think you guys can respond to those, either or both of those questions as you'd like.
Well, I don't see Trotskyism as an entirely unified movement. I mean, obviously, the Fourth International, there is a broad coherence to Trotskyism, but there are a lot of different variants. Perry Anderson, of course, was, who wrote Considerations on Western Marxism, came from the Trotskyist tradition and very much part of that. But he himself excludes a lot of Trotskyists from his Western Marxist category. For example, somebody like Ernst Mandel, who is a very different kind of animal, but actually a prominent figure, is left out of the analysis. And I could give many other examples. And it wouldn't be correct to say that Trotskyist thinkers simply ignored imperialism, but obviously, being in the Trotskyist tradition, there was a very strong opposition to Soviet Marxism, particularly from the 1930s on. So it's a complicated question. I don't think that Trotskyism generally abandoned the dialectics of nature or materialism, but thinkers like Anderson did. And so I would say, it all depends. It's there are many really important Trotskyist thinkers that are critical of these trends, and others maybe who have succumbed to them, and divisions within. And so I would hesitate to criticize on that ground. And in terms of different strategies in the North and the South, well, this is a complicated thing, but obviously the North, I mean, if we follow Lenin on this, the North has an upper stratum that is part of a labor aristocracy. We can do that look at that in various ways, but there is a part of what we call the working class, upper stratum of the working class, definitely in the North, that has been brought into imperialism. Lenin's answer to that was to dig deeper, to go to the real working class. And but there are, the United States, for example, is the leading imperialist country in the world. It's very reactionary. The role of the primary role of Marxists in the United States is to oppose the U.S. Imperialist machine from within. That is our role, even more than what we would call the class struggle as itself. But we do it from within, which is different and in support of the Global South. But in the Global South, there are more revolutionary possibilities present. And in terms of, let's say, the environmental problem, the Global North is the principal problem in terms of having these ecological footprints that for the United States, if the whole world had ecological footprint of the United States, you'd need 4 planets. And the overshoot of the ecological overshoot in the North has to be reversed, and that requires a reconstitution of society at large. But in terms of, it would have to involve some elements of what we call degrowth. In the Global South, it's different. Many of the countries most in the Global South are using per capita energy uses way below the global average, below the sustainable level for the planet as a whole. And those countries have to be able to develop. And imperialism is blocking that in various ways. So the strategies are different because we're in different places. But there could be a unity of action in the sense that we have a common cause, which we fight in different ways depending on our positions.
Thank you, Radhika. Gabriel?
Sure, I'll agree with John on what he said about Trotskyism. It's a very wide-ranging phenomenon. A lot of what Trotsky said is worth reading, listening to. I mean, it's, he stands opposed to the mainstream communist tradition in certain ways, but not in others. He was part of it for a very long time, and so I mean, it's Trotskyism is one thing, Trotsky is another thing. I would also, in terms of anti-imperialism as well, I think that if we wanted to be very brief, I would say that anti-imperialism begins at home, and people in the West in particular have a special duty to oppose imperialism, which is something that's not happening at the moment because such large parts of the left are, being distracted by some of the worst elements of what we are calling Western Marxism today, which have denied imperialism, which have condemned attempts to construct socialism elsewhere as regressive, totalitarian, etc., etc. So all these things are problems. And I would say that, in many ways, I often argue that the theory of the three worlds, which often people feel a bit leery about because they think that to call the developing world the third world means that this is like somehow derogatory, that third world means third class. It doesn't mean that. It has historically very different origins, and it was taken up by the third world countries themselves at venues like Bandung and so on. So, I mean, it's different. But I would say that the origin of this tripartite division of the world actually is found, at least as far as I could trace it back, in actually a text of 1916 by Lenin on the self-determination of nations, in which he says, what are the things that people, what should communists do, in the present situation? And he said, well, in the three different parts of the world, there are three different answers. And he says in the imperialist world, obviously, they should oppose imperialism. In that part of the world that was not formally colonized, or that was not colonized generally, in which he includes Eastern Europe and Russia, he says that their aim is to connect their own struggles of the working class with the struggles of the peoples of, the anti-colonial struggles against imperialism. And then obviously in the countries where imperialism is in control, formally or informally, they have to struggle against imperialism. So this tripartite division of the world is actually quite old and makes a lot of sense precisely again in that imperialist framework, which is the necessary framework for analyzing the international relations of the capitalist era. So I would say that, that would be my answer to those two questions, or those would be my answers to those two questions.
Jen, I'm going to just say something quickly on that front. One is that I think it's very important to understand by anti-imperialism a scientific analysis of the material history of the development and, most importantly, the underdevelopment of the world. And that there are many discourses on the left, including Marxist discourses, that are against forms of imperialism that, in my opinion, don't actually exist in the material world. And so when we're talking about imperialism, I take it in its most general sense, the underdevelopment of certain regions of the world for the development of others, and mainly for the lining of the pockets of the imperial ruling class. And that this is a long-standing project on the part of the imperial core and is very different than a special military operation or developing one's defense strategies in order to keep imperialism out or other things along those lines. And so there's broad discourses about China being imperialist or all socialist countries being imperialist. And I don't think we should assume that they're imperialist and then be anti-imperialist. I think that the anti-imperialist framing needs to be scientifically as rigorous as possible, and that will demarcate between different forms of Marxism that might call themselves anti-imperialist. But I take it that the one that we're referring to is very specifically focused on the struggle against the imperial core of Western Europe, United States, and all the satellites against the underdevelopment of the tricontinent, basically. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, and it's a thing that I think is very important to recognize regarding the history of global Marxism, as John was saying earlier, is that there's a widespread social chauvinism that has made it appear to some people that the vanguard of Marxism is of necessity in the West. And it is true that due to imperial underdevelopment of the rest of the world, there are very powerful institutions of higher learning within the imperial core. There are very high developed forms of science that have emerged within the imperial core due to the reasons of imperialism. But the real vanguard of Marxism, if we understand by Marxism not just the interpretation of the world, but the transformation of the world, in particular for the most exploited and oppressed, is clearly across the broader global South. And that a lot of what you have in the imperial core, both at a political and practical level, but also at an intellectual level, is there's a lot of rearguard Marxism that's trying to hold that back. And so getting rid of the social chauvinism and seeing the vanguard of Marxism in the practical project of fighting real imperialism in order to build up the socialist project, I think is really at the core of a lot of the conversation that we're having. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Jennifer.
If it's okay with our speakers, I'd like to just do one more round of questions and then we can wrap up. I'm going to, again, kind of combine a couple of these questions, and you can feel free to respond as you'd like. The first kind of combo question is, one is, how is the kind of concept of imperialism diluted in Western Marxism? And I think related to this is this other question about how the inter-imperialist framework that is very common today, the one that would see, for example, China as an imperialist power competing with the US, how does this kind of framework erase the colonial and national question? And why is this framework so pervasive today, particularly in some forms of Maoism? And then the other question that I wanted to pose came from the chat, and this is a question about, it's a very large question about connections between US-led imperialism and fascism. And the person who asked this question was specifically asking for recommendations of further reading on that topic. And whoever wants to speak first, go ahead.
Well, I just wrote a big article on the way in which imperialism is diluted in Western Marxism, or on the left. It's called the new denial of imperialism on the left. It appears in the November issue of Month Review, and there are actually a lot of ways in which imperialism, the notion of imperialism, is being diluted by prominent figures on the left. For example, David Harvey, who says, well, he says incorrectly, empirically, he presents the empirically false point, and there's enormous evidence against it, that that there is a drain now occurring from the west to the east, and that's just completely false. I provide a lot of evidence to show why it's false. There's a lot of attempts, and there are various reasons for this, to remove monopoly capitalism from the notion of imperialism, to argue that, and Vivek Chibber argues this, that there's that imperialism is political and not economic, to separate those, or that imperialism is just when one country attacks another. There are attempts like by William Robinson to argue that one nation cannot exploit another. Radhika's already given a quote by Marx that goes against that. And there's arguments that imperialism isn't really that is, it doesn't, there's no center periphery anymore. That was hard to Negri, and of course Harvey agrees with that imperialism has been replaced by globalization, so as a vague category, or shifting hegemonies, like Arrighi argued. There's notions that imperialism in Lenin is only horizontal, just fought out between the leading capitalist nations, and that it never really involved the North-South relations. There's arguments that there are good imperialism and bad imperialism, like Gilbert Ashkar argues that it's okay to support military interventions by the West, like in Libya, because as long as it's a good imperialism on the support of popular forces. You can look at the results of that. But there are dozens that, now ways in which it's trying to, and thinkers are trying to get around the notion of imperialism or bend it on the left. And this is today it's a product of the new Cold War and an attempt to destroy the notion of a global South as the being on the side of the global South. Some argue that to take that position is to be a campist, but that's the position that Lenin and Luxemburg took, and so on. So there is there is a real problem here. I tried to explain it in that article, but a clear anti-imperialism with a scientific basis, as Gabriel says, cannot be really distorted effectively in this way. The conditions, the material conditions, the empirical reality is just too clear. There's a notion that China's imperialist, but China's never been in a war except on, or the People's Republic's never been on a war except on its borders, while the United States has invaded 101 different countries. So anyway, there's that. In terms of the connection between imperialism and fascism, it's, I can't think offhand a real good developed analysis on that, but I would suggest to read the epilogue to the Destruction of Reason by Lukács, which addressed that in the 1950s, and was very, very powerful and accurate, and gave definite instances, even of criticizing Western Marxists in the sense that we've been talking about, and that is now treated and has been treated ever since, for about 70 years as some objectionable, unspeakable statement on his part. And if you look at the reactions, let's say, look at Traverso's introduction to the new edition of The Destruction of Reason, where he attacks Lukács on that point, and compare it to what Lukács was saying about the continuity in imperialism, because fascism is a product of capitalism and imperialism, you get two very different points of view, and Lukács' view looks better and better every single day.
Should I go next, or yeah? I just wanted to say, particularly I wanted to go next because I just wanted to remark after John's point about the new introduction by Enzo Traverso. I mean, I read the Lukács book in the 90s, and I haven't returned to it since, so I have no idea what I'd love to go back and reread this epilogue, but I just want to say it is really horrible how completely reactionary intellectuals are invited to write introductions to new editions of important works. I'm thinking in particular of Tristram Hunt's introduction to Engels's Family, Private Property and State. I mean, if you sit and read it, I assure you, you'll have smoke coming out of your ears in a very short time, So it's really, really cheap and awful, and it totally cheapens the text. But anyway, let me just go on to say that in no particular order, some general things in reaction to the questions you pose. So on the connection between imperialism and fascism, I mean, I'm sure that this company is completely familiar with the notion, which, by the way, Losurdo also discusses, that the thing about fascism that was so shocking to Europeans is that it brought to Europe ways of dealing with people that had been practiced routinely in the colonies, but never brought to Europe. So that's what, to us, I mean, to me, obviously, if it's possible, the homelands of capitalism should be kept free of certain types of oppressions. Losurdo's previous book, Liberalism, A Counter-History, is absolutely brilliant at showing how this is the case vis-a-vis slavery and so on. So, so those relations can be practiced there, but they shouldn't be brought to Europe. And that has a whole series of justifications, not least that, theoretically, the legal framework would not work very well if people were not formally equal, at least. Whereas in the colonies, you could treat them as formally unequal and equal in every other respect and so on. So, I mean, I would say that's the basic connection between imperialism and fascism. So what that tells you is that capitalism is normally based on exceedingly or let me rephrase that, capitalism is normally based on extraordinary levels of oppression and repression, in that these must occur in the colonized or imperial or subjugated parts of the world. Meantime, it appears not to be based, and that's where, by the way, this whole thing about what is it? The absence of relations of personal dependence in the first world is somehow, regarded as this, this way of distinguishing liberal societies from other societies and so on. But the fact is, the existence of liberal society in the first world countries relies on the creation of relations of personal dependence in the rest of the world, in the perpetuation of certain of these relations. So to me, those are what the relation is that the normal operation of capitalism requires these relations in the rest of the world, and in extraordinary circumstances, these relations will come home to roost. So that is the relation between the two. I just wanted to say that I also agree that the terms like globalization have been messing around with our understanding of imperialism. So, for example, I teach courses on international political economy, and the idea of globalization, of course, is very big there. So we are told, when people like Anthony Giddens and David Held and others trotted out the notion of globalization back in the 1990s, a lot of people pointed out that, what are you talking about? Insofar as you are referring to the interconnection of the world economy, it was higher back in 1914 than it is now. And then they said, oh, well, that means just that there was a first wave of globalization, which peaked in 1914, and now there's a new wave of globalization. I said, I'm sorry, like there is a perfectly good term which we used to use to describe what peaked in 1914, and that was imperialism. So why are we now bringing in this notion of globalization? But anyway, so in that sense, globalization has become another way of not talking about imperialism. By the way, so has the idea of US hegemony. I mean, what is this? It's a ridiculous, and of course my argument is that it was never successful, that imperialism has been on a long, unfortunately all too long decline. It should have finished declining by now and, simply disappeared, but it's still there. But it has been on a decline since 1914, and the US had the misfortune of arriving at the world stage and trying to emulate British-style dominance precisely when it had become next to impossible. But anyway, it tried, it keeps trying. That is why the world keeps, the rubble keeps bouncing around the world. But okay, so that's about globalization and US hegemony. Imperialism is political, not economic. Of course, how can you have, this does two things. Number one, one of the reasons why the idea of imperialism has become so messy is that people think that you can talk about the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or even the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the same breath as you can talk about the British Empire or the French Empire, etc. These are not the same kinds of empire. They're very different types of empires. And so I think that much more work needs to be done on that. But that's the first point I wanted to make. So that to say that it's not economic is it's just a way of denying that the imperative of imperialism arises from the contradictions of capitalism, and that the other types of imperialism, whatever they were, and I'm not saying they were fantastic, but they were different, the dynamics were different. And then the other thing, of course, is that to say that imperialism is whether, to even take a statement that it's either economic or political, this to me is part of the deeper problem which I was referring to, Gabriel, when I asked you the question about the theory industry and what you call normal social sciences. I mean, to me, the birth of neoclassical economics is accompanied with what I call a new social scientific division of labor, which then ends up being justified by Weber, who says that, it is a characteristic of modern life that unfortunately different types of social activity acquire autonomy of their own, and then they must be studied by their own disciplines. So we have to divide economy from society and then eventually political science and blah, blah, and so on. This is, of course, I mean, Marx would have, when people say I'm a Marxist economist, I mean, that's like an oxymoron. Marx wasn't a Marxist economist. Marx studied political economy. There was no such thing as economics in Marx's time. Political economy was a historically integrated way of understanding the evolution of societies, and these things were not separated. So when you say that it is economic and political, I just find that it's very problematic. So yeah, and then I should just add that one of the other reasons why the understanding of imperialism is confused is that we don't fully take on board the extent to which, in addition to the intellectual problems that I was referring to earlier, with the encounter between Marxism and neoclassical economics, I think the other thing is that that was an intellectual problem, but there was also a corresponding political problem, which is that from the late 19th and early 20th century onwards, the tradition of what we call social democracy, which was back then Marxist, had already come to certain guns and butter types of political compromises that we will accept imperialism provided you give us reform, etc. And this compromise is quite long-standing. It has continued in our time. It has become worse in our time, and so on. So again, if we don't understand this, then we are not going to understand how deep these problems go on the Western left. I don't want to go on for very long, so I'll just say one other thing. And that is, no, maybe two other things. Number one, I can't emphasize enough how critically important development, that is to say, the development of the forces of production, the development of the conditions of production, etc., is for anti-imperialism. It is the essence of anti-imperialism. You can't stand up to the powers that be without this. That is why you can fight the most heroic wars, but you can lose the battle of development. And the reason why China is so important is that it has won on both fronts. And that's why China is so important today. And the final thing is, I would simply like to make a plea that can we please call whatever it is that we are endorsing the revival of, not global Marxism, but world Marxism. Please. Thank you.
Jen, should I go ahead and jump in? Yeah. So those were great comments. I'm going to focus on some of the things that weren't touched on quite as explicitly. I would recommend that everybody, if they haven't already, read John Bellamy Foster's most recent article that he referenced in Monthly Review. It is excellent. It covers a lot of the things that we're talking about and also gives you ample detail. So as soon as you get off the call, please go and read that if you haven't already. The question about the inter-imperialist framing and how prevalent it is in certain Maoist circles, without commenting on the Maoist side of it, I do think that projects of socialist modernization have very frequently been belittled and discredited by imperialist propaganda based on a naturalization of capitalist social relations, meaning that the assumption is that if a socialist country has been able to develop itself, it must be doing it like the big bad capitalists have done it, by expropriating, super exploiting, colonizing, and doing all of these heinous practices that the capitalists have engaged in. And that's a very easy mechanism of propaganda because it's basically a form of political projection. So when you have the US power brokers saying, oh, China, look, it's so developed. Well, how did it get developed? They must have done all of these horrible things. And it's a very easy, I guess, propaganda line. And what we need to do is instead engage in dialectical materialist analysis to look at the specificities of their projects of development and recognize that, well, China, just to take this example, doesn't have colonies. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't have 800 plus military bases around the world and other such things. Concerning the final question on the relationship between imperialism and fascism, I do think that fascism, as it's functioned within the capitalist world system, is a modality of political management that cannot be reduced to the specific forms of fascism that emerged in Italy, Germany, and Japan to some extent, but actually is, as Rodica was alluding to, a principal form of political management when it is a question of imposing or expanding capitalist social relations by any means necessary, by the mobilization of parastate forces or state violence to repress populations that do not want to accept proletarianization, land theft, etc. And today, with the war in Ukraine, with Israel's ongoing wars, we have two excellent examples that I think are very deserving of in-depth study, insofar as we see fascism operating as the kind of cutting edge of imperialism. And as far as sources on this front, Samir Amin's excellent book, Russia and the Long Transition from Capitalism to Socialism, has a final chapter that deals with fascism in Ukraine. And in general, I think Samir Amin's work on fascism is excellent and deserving of very wide readership. I wrote an article as well called "The U.S. Did Not Defeat Fascism in World War II. It discreetly internationalized it," in which I go into some of the dark history of the U.S. national security state, directly recuperating fascists from Italy, Germany, and Japan in order to set up what is ultimately a kind of international architecture for their emergent, not emergent in the sense that it was new, but their really developed imperialist project in the wake of World War II. I'll leave it at that, just to say as well that I've really enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot, and this is very rich, and I hope that we'll have other opportunities to collaborate along these lines.
Thank you all so much. This has been such an incredibly interesting event, and it's been really an honor to hear from all of you. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Really great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, I just ended